Hello everyone, welcome back to Automotive Logistics and Supply Chain Europe Live with me, Christopher Ludwig. Welcome to what's surely to be one of our most anticipated sessions of the event, the one where we solve all of the computer chip and semiconductor shortage issues. Okay, I can't promise it's going to be quite as easy as that, but as we've been saying throughout this event, rather than just focusing on the what of the now in terms of the disruptions and the challenges of the day, obviously, we want to focus more on the solutions and lessons to avoid and mitigate later on. And of course, the semiconductor issue has been causing considerable supply chain disruptions and for at least the past 2 quarters or so, and has no easy fix. But as I think you'll hear, the way that the industry responds now and acts in the wake of this crisis could indeed be the foundation for a very fruitful partnership and development of this critical part of the supply chain going forward. Because let's face it, the amount of computer chips and semiconductors going into vehicles is only set to grow. So we want to get this discussion right, and therefore I'm really pleased and overjoyed, in fact, to have this panel of experts join me on stage. So I'd like to introduce Bettina Weiss, who's the Chief of Staff of Global Smart Mobility and Global Smart Mobility Lead at SEMI, a key association representing electronic manufacturing and design supply chains, and she has extensive experience in the semiconductor supply chain. Mike Hogan, Senior Vice President of Automotive, Industrial, and Multi-Market Business Units at Global Foundries, an American semiconductor foundry based in California, but with international operations. And Jeremy Bouchard, Director of Autonomy, EE, and Semiconductors at IHS Markit, and as such, an expert in this sector and here to give us some insights. Welcome to you all.
Morning.
Hello.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Indeed, I should say good morning as well, because Bettina and Mike are joining us from the West Coast of the US. So obviously this is a global topic impacting all regions. With that in mind, let's set the scene a little bit here. Got a visual that we just want to pull up. This is kind of where we are. And I want to just kind of ask you, Jeremy, to start. Just set the scene a little bit for us. We can see the headlines there in terms of how the automotive industry is being impacted by this issue.
Yeah, so this is a slide which I borrowed from our team following the car production here at IHS Markit. So this slide is recording the cumulative impact of a chip shortage on the car production. So since the beginning of the year, already 2 million cars could not be produced because of this chip shortage. So that was 1.4 million in the first quarter. On just over 2 weeks in the second quarter, we are already at 700,000 cars. So it looks, as you can see, the second quarter is not looking better than the first quarter. On this slide, we show the split by region of production, and it's quite interesting to see Europe, China, or North America all impacted in a similar manner here, all of them having about 350,000 vehicles not produced because of this crisis, while Japan and Korea in the first quarter were less impacted. But if you're looking at the gray bar here, so for the first two and a half weeks of the second quarter, you see everybody is impacted, even Japan and Korea being already impacted as much for these first 2 weeks as all of the first quarter of this year.
So some pretty dramatic numbers there, Jeremy, and indeed keeping in mind that those Q2 figures are, as you just said, 2 weeks as opposed to it's not even remotely half of the quarter. So trending pretty difficult there. In terms of, maybe I can ask the panel to comment on a little bit how you see this unfolding now, kind of in the immediate term. Maybe Bettina, from your association and all the context across, is this something working through, feeling for the next couple of quarters and beyond?
Yes, I actually looked at your poll just a couple of days ago, and I believe it's now over 35% of people saying they expect this crisis to actually spill into 2022, which really speaks to the severity of the shortage crisis. I think what Jeremy just shared also speaks to the increasing interdependence of the electronic supply chain and the automotive supply chain. One needs the other. And I think this is a pretty stark example of what happens when one of the key components in today's car manufacturing is not available.
Absolutely, and Mike, obviously you're right in the heart of this as a foundry. How do you see this playing out over the next couple of quarters?
Yeah, I think there'll be a few stages of recovery. There's sort of a 90-day offset to when a foundry produces a wafer and it's probably available to be in a car. So I think the trough was probably Q1, and that's what's overshadowing Q2. Supply will come back pretty aggressively starting in Q2, but I think what everybody has to realize is that this is as much a problem of mix as it is of absolute volume. There's an incredible diversity of feature-rich chips that go into a variety of these automotive subsystems, and so you have to get the mix exactly right. And then ultimately, coming out in 22, it's still going to be a very tight demand-supply situation, and you've got very aggressive actions by folks wanting to secure supply for 2022. So automakers and their tier ones will have to be equally assertive, because I think in 22, your access to supply will dictate your company's ability to succeed.
So the kind of brunt of the crisis might be worse, or hit its apex, so to speak. But it sounds like we'll be feeling these aftershocks and effects for quite some time to come. Jeremy, would you add anything further to that sort of analysis of what you see coming ahead?
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add here is one thing which makes reading any signs of recovery really difficult is what we call the toilet paper effect. We really see a lot of OEMs on tier one more in a panic mode right now, on double ordering the number of chips they really need just to make sure they get what they really need. For example, several chip vendors told us they received orders for this year equivalent to 130 million cars, as opposed to about 84 million cars, which will really be produced. So you see an inflation of a demand, which really makes it difficult to predict what is the real shortage, as opposed to an inflated demand here, which is artificially expanding the duration of its shortage.
There's a kind of classic bullwhip there effect, certainly being felt. I've heard a comment. Some OEMs are trying to secure a year's supply. The only question is which year, because by the time they actually can get grabs of that. So clearly complicated picture there. Bettina, maybe a bit of a comment from your side on a regional comparison. Jeremy's slide there showed us that Europe, US, China, pretty similar hit, at least on that Q1. From what you're kind of feeling on the ground, on the semiconductor side and OEMs, is there a feeling that Europe will be better off, worse off, similar as we go forward as well? Obviously, I ask in the context of a European event here, so just to put that a little bit in its context as well.
I think the pain is distributed relatively equally, maybe with the exception of Japan. They tend to manage their supply chain a little differently, I believe, with respect to a commitment to take inventory and just a tighter grip on their supplier base. But I think for the rest of the world, it's a pretty even picture. And it points to the global nature of the semiconductor business, right? While there are centers of manufacturing, certainly in Asia, for example, chip travels around the world multiple times before it ends up in a system or an application. So it's a big equalizer.
Yeah, and maybe Jeremy, maybe you can shed some light again. I just I mentioned at the beginning that the value of chips and semiconductors obviously is high and going higher, we'd imagine. Do you have any can you give us any sense of that development in terms of figures or percentages, and how we see the value changing in the years ahead?
Okay, yes. So there are typically more than 1,000 chips in average per car today. So it's very clearly you cannot build a car without chip. In terms of value, it depends on the type of car. So if you have a conventional engine, you will have in average around $400 of chips in a car. If it's an electric car, you will have around closer to $700. On the difference is a lot due to the expensive chips going into the electric motor management, but also an electric car often comes with more features in terms of infotainment, in terms of ADAS. So that's why electric car actually comes with a much higher semiconductor content on its increase. We've seen over the past few years the average value of chips per car increasing typically around 7% per year, and it's going to continue in this range.
So clearly a strong growth trend there. And maybe one thing I wanted to ask you, Mike, for Global Foundries, you mentioned that capacity is ramping up, and I trust we mean there are some automotive specific. So for Global Foundries, is that a specific sector focus now clearly to ramp up capacity specific for automotive chips?
Yeah, well, at Global Foundries, automotive's a really important market, and ironically, one of the best markets for semiconductor and foundry is automotive. So in the long term, we're a perfect match for each other because we appreciate and get benefit out of long-term stable relationships. The idea on adding capacity is a little bit tricky in that, as I mentioned, the automotive mix is so broad. You essentially have to add capacity everywhere. And as Jeremy pointed out, if you've got some noise in the system and people competing for their particular part, there's no overarching supercomputer figuring out the exact best wafers to build to get the maximum number of cars, because you have different interests. You have OEMs who are interested in what they need from their tier ones, who choose different chips, which come from different foundries. So there's no magic bullet to say if I increase more of this type of wafer, everything gets solved. You sort of are needing to, in general, increase the capacity, because the antimatter here, the thing you don't see, is the amount of demand that's coming from all the other markets in a post-COVID world. So there's no relief on that. So in general, when you see folks crying out for more investment, that's generally the right answer. You just need to build more semiconductors because the world runs on semiconductors. Automotive being a particular case of that, but there's still this interplay between the breadth of everything that is needed to increase versus the idea that this is if we just had more of one specific type of chip, all would be good. It's not that simple.
And yeah, I wanted to maybe drill slightly into that because we tend to talk about lack of microcontrollers, processors. There's also been some focus on the real cutting edge chip technology, but I get the sense that it's not just about these AI chips, is it? It's about more, let's call standard chips going in cars, and I guess if I'm understanding you correctly, finding the balance of what actually is needed from those as well is what's holding back some of the production today.
Yeah. So I mean, like Jeremy pointed out, there's a lot of different chips that go in a car, and these can range over technologies that have been in production for 15 or 20 years. So the good thing about them is they've been honed to be very feature specific for the things that auto needs. But as like Jeremy mentioned, this shift to electric vehicle is a shift away from anything in this advanced manufacturing node. These are maybe these are technologies that have been around for 20 or 25 years, but they're very good at things like.
Oh, I think we might have had a slight disruption there. Bettina, Jeremy, you can still hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you, yeah.
We'll get Mike right back, I'm sure. Mike, you're back. Good. Can you hear us, Mike?
Yeah, sorry about that.
We just had a slight Silicon Valley moment there. You were just saying that the EV chips are not actually, in these cases, the rise of really high-end chips. It's actually technology that's been around 20 years.
EV chips, radar chips, these are technologies that have been around a long time, but they've been subject to a lot of R&D to embed more and more features that are specific to automotive. And the economics of those process nodes fit the high diversity, high mix, moderate volume of auto very well. Whereas, the very advanced nodes are great if you have $500 million to do a chip and you have 1,000 people to work on it. But, it's a problem if you have to build 1,000 different chips to go into a car. You really can't do them at that scale. So, there's a lot of sense to it. It's not just if auto had moved to leading edge, it would all be okay. It actually doesn't. The economics don't work that way.
I understand. Bettina, in your view, or in the view of the the companies you're talking to, have the automotive industry, have OEMs had enough understanding and visibility of their chip and semiconductor supply chains, or is this something that they've sort of managed at a remove, and has that contributed somewhat to the problem?
Yeah, there's primarily been the partnership with the tier one, the OEM and the tier one company and tier one supplier, where these types of discussions have taken place. But even pre-pandemic and pre-shortage, there have been increased efforts on all parts and all stakeholders to actually increase the transparency and increase the dialogue between the two ecosystems, electronics manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing, and automotive, because it became clear that as the supply chains intertwine and become more and more interdependent, one needed to develop a much better understanding of the other, and that goes both ways. Did it get to the level of efficiency yet in terms of, do we have the sense that everybody knows what's going on and how we can fix it? No, clearly not. I talked to an OEM in Europe just a few days ago who said, I really need to educate my top management because there's not enough awareness, there's not enough understanding of how the semiconductor supply chain works, the cyclicality of it, and how that bumps against sometimes the automotive electronics ecosystem and their own supply chain dynamics. So clearly, a lot of need for dialogue and conversations.
Yeah, I can see you nodding there now, Jeremy. Is that seems to align with your analysis of the industry so far?
Yeah, absolutely. We also see the OEM really in the dark right now. They're telling us they're feeling completely exposed when they hear about this cold storm in Texas, on hearing about 3 fabs which are shut down. They go to their tier one and they're asking, okay, how does it affect me? How does it affect my cars, the ECUs I'm buying? And they don't get any answer. There is really an absolute lack of transparency. They also did not realize how much they were the concentration of the entire industry in the hands of a few foundries like TSMC as well. So there is a big learning curve ahead of the OEMs. We see they realize they have to learn it much better now.
It would seem, or at least it seems to be reported, that some OEMs have perhaps outperformed others. Toyota comes up as mentioned. We've noticed some of the German plants, at least in the US, have run longer. Would we attribute this to better planning, to some stockpiling, to luck, to connections to Japan? I mean, is there anything out of looking across the sector where we might say, this is kind of a good example, or actually, like I said, is it a little just more luck in that point? Maybe Jeremy, I might start with you there again.
Okay, well, it's not only luck. I mean, definitely, BMW, for example, has done better in the first quarter. It doesn't surprise us, because I remember when I visited them a couple of years ago, I was very impressed with their purchasing department for electronics, including chips. They had a full team really dedicated to understanding the supply chain here. And I noticed that talking to chip vendor, they were also telling us BMW is managing it really well. Toyota is the other example. We've been asked a lot, actually, the last 2-3 months, why did Toyota seem to do better through this crisis? So the first thing, it's interesting. The first thing we did was to look at who are the microcontroller suppliers to Toyota, because microcontrollers have been very often the bottleneck here. We looked at several cars here, and we were impressed by the high reliance of Toyota on Renesas, so a single supplier. I remember on the Toyota Camry, out of 18 microcontrollers, 17 were coming out of Renesas. So it was contra-intuitive. We did not understand. And then we went deeper. We looked at the company structure of Toyota. And Toyota is at the heart of of this so-called keiretsu, this typical Japanese company structure, where Toyota earns part of its supplier. So Toyota earns part of Denso, parts of Renesas as a chip supplier, but you also have a network of 7-8 banks, which all are also owning about 80% in total from Toyota, from Denso, from Renesas. And it creates a very tight bond of shared interest here, which enables to put in place longer-term shared industrial strategies, which are not really feasible so easily outside of such a financial construct here. And we've noticed here, that's why a company like Toyota is placing much longer order to Renesas, so more 12 weeks or 12 months rather than 12 weeks, in exchange for the commitment of Renesas to put in place the capacity. So there is a long-term commitment, firm orders against supply assurance. The other thing as well we've seen there with Toyota or with other Japanese groups like this is a higher inventory. So typically 3 to 4, 5 months of inventory held at distributors, which are part of this group here, to provide a kind of buffer here for Japanese companies, and we don't see that outside of Japan. So this is one of the reasons why Toyota has done better in the first quarter. But now that Renesas has been hit hard with this fab fire in Naka in Japan, Renesas being the main supplier by far to Toyota, Toyota is actually going to be exposed as well in Q2.
So fascinating, because as you've made it very clear, there are quite a diverse set of reasons why some of that might have worked, but in this case, obviously some exposure. Mike, in terms of your customers, obviously automotive being so important to global foundries, how would you respond to some of what you've just heard there? And then is there kind of other ways that you would suggest for your automotive customers to be getting closer to understanding this industry, this supply chain better?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to Jeremy's explanation of Japan is the other good fortune they had is that in this era, the Japanese semiconductor companies like Renesas are less exposed to the handset world, right? Because 20 years ago they would have also had the pull of handsets, grabbing share ahead of automotive, and they weren't as exposed in this particular crisis because the handset world has sort of moved on. So that was good fortune as well as good strategy. I think that you try to think of how those ideas would apply to the rest of the world. And I would say that the primary thing you're going to have to see is that tier ones and auto OEMs are going to have to behave more for a product whose user experience is more predicated on the silicon and the software. You have to behave more like companies where that's the case. And that means a much more intimate relationship from R&D all the way to supply. And ultimately, securing the supply you will need. Smartphone makers don't build a phone platform and hope the supply is there. Automakers can actually deliver very high quality commitments out in time, but they're going to have to kind of step up and say, look, here's a commercial arrangement where you'll be happy to hold some capacity for me in the future, and I'll just cordon it off from the rest of the world. And that's, in the long term, these are imminently doable things. It's just, hindsight being 2020, you can't go back in time and say, boy, I wish I had done that. But I think that's what you'll see going forward. I think you'll just see them figuring out what technologies they'd like to have in their car, directing their supply chain to utilize them, and making some commercial commitments such that they don't have to worry that, when markets get hot elsewhere, that their supply is vulnerable. And again, the bad news is that wasn't done. The good news is it's very doable. And I think that's what you're going to see going forward in the rest of the world. Yeah,
as I said at the beginning, actually decisive moment here to kind of shape that path ahead. But Tina, do you already see any signs of OEMs or tier ones looking to take more of that control, management, and design of their chip supply chains?
Absolutely, and even pre-COVID and pre-shortage, we've seen that increasingly happening, because I think at least among a few leading OEMs, there is certainly a recognition that more of an integrated strategy for automotive electronics and chips in cars makes a lot more sense than maintaining this fairly rigid hierarchy of suppliers going down the chain. So doing it in concert with tier ones, with semiconductor suppliers and the entire semiconductor manufacturing supply chain provides opportunities to partner at different junctures. We've seen now a joint project among Volkswagen, for example, and Integris, a particle contamination company. So it enables technology innovation in a collective sense with more transparency without really compromising differentiation and competitiveness. This can take the form of standards, for example, of best known methods, but it all starts with the recognition that we need to open the aperture a little bit and talk together at one table.
And I think on that, you recently did an interview with our publication, and I believe SEMI has created a global automotive advisory council. So maybe you can just give us a little insight into, the companies that are engaging there and any of the initiatives relevant to this topic that might be underway.
Absolutely. We started the GAAC, the Global Automotive Advisory Council, in early 2018. We started with a Europe chapter because that's where we had, not surprisingly, the most momentum. Participating companies are representatives of all segments of the supply chain, from silicon wafer manufacturers all the way through equipment, materials, design, package, foundry, device maker, and tier one and OEM. So that platform in an antitrust environment, totally compliant environment, allows people to actually focus on technical issues that they want to resolve. For example, device robustness and reliability is a huge topic. Cybersecurity is a huge topic. These are all topics where you need partners and expertise to actually solve a problem together. So the platform was created precisely for this, for a safe environment for these discussions to happen. And I think this will actually come in very handy for the current chip shortage situation to be discussed and resolved, hopefully, as well.
Absolutely. Well, on behalf of Automotive Logistics, want to obviously extend the invitation to communicate and get deeper involved to our global audience of supply chain experts here, for whom this issue has certainly come into focus. Another topic I wanted to address here, and Jeremy, I'll turn to you first on it. I mean, what we've seen in response from governments, certainly at the US with the Biden administration, at the EU level and in Germany, quite a direct push for more localization, some push for some lot of money to go behind that as well. The EU has the IPCEI and other microelectronics 2 program. Biden has talked billions and billions towards this. Is this an important part of the solution, or is it missing the point a little bit?
I'm muting first. Well, it's adding capacity helps. I mean, it's not going in the wrong direction. But what we notice is most of these initiatives are really focused on the very advanced technology nodes. The one you just mentioned here, this IPCEI, it's 2 nanometer. So it's not going to help the kind of shortage we have now, because as Mike said before, the shortage now on chips is for technologies which have been deployed 15 years ago already, on 40, 90, 130 nanometer. I see very little or no push here from these political initiatives in this direction. So it's good for securing access to these strategic technologies for other areas, for AI chips, but it doesn't help with the chip shortage.
Mike, is that how you see it from the US perspective there as well, in terms of the gestures, let's say, made from the Biden administration?
I mean, yeah, Global Foundries, as the name implies, is really the only foundry that operates globally. So we run factories on 3 different continents, and we think the different regions sort of have different, different agendas that all sort of sound the same in terms of increasing the amount of semiconductor capability in their region. And I think in general, that is a good thing. I think it will help. It's a very capital intensive business. There's been a demand shock. that demand shock will ripple through, for years to come. So you really do have to do something. The focus on leading edge, I completely agree with Jeremy. Good intent, but a little bit misplaced. What you really need is you need to sort of grow the availability of semiconductors in all these regions, and then mature the tier 1 and OEM strategies to say, how much comfort do I have with where my supply comes from? And I would point out the other real advantage we have in these feature-rich, more pervasive, higher quantity of the wafers that are required, is that these are portable from facility to facility. So there's no reason you can't run, for instance, 40 nanometer in Southeast Asia and 40 nanometer in Europe, and you can have the supply chain decide where they want to have their risks. Again, it doesn't happen overnight, but I think there's a real benefit to having a global footprint and allowing people to decide where they dial in their risk management. And what we've all described is there was not really any risk management. So this is how you wind up in a crisis. Now we have to sort of build up, the risk profile that you're willing to take on, whether that's a fire somewhere that you can't predict, or an earthquake, you also can't predict, but will probably happen, and how many different regions you're exposed to. So it's a generally really good idea for industrial policy in the U.S. to increase semiconductor footprint, but there's no magic bullet. It needs to sort of cover all of the needs. And I just point out, more than 90% of the wafers produced today have nothing to do with bleeding edge technology, and they fuel everything that makes your life run. So let's be balanced, I guess, is the message that we brought to Washington when my boss virtually sat down with the Biden administration last week.
Well, that again, it's really interesting to hear, and I think in some ways it sounds like I don't want to say normalization, but obviously other parts of the automotive supply chain operate exactly in the way that you mentioned, obviously with platforms across different regions, scale to capacity, leveraged across where needed. So it sounds like hopefully this part of the supply chain moves back, into somewhat of the norm for the industry. We're coming up on a few minutes. I mean, one quick thing from the audience is just a comment that I thought I'd maybe to you, Jeremy, maybe more of a reflection than a question. Is just the comment is interesting to hear that Toyota, of course, the original just-in-time company, has been helped by a buffer strategy, while other OEMs have taken JIT to the extreme and been left vulnerable. So it's a. I'm not sure if what you said, that Toyota specifically buffered differently. I think you suggested that was part of their long-term strategy of buying in advance and having these distributors. But nonetheless, the comment there, obviously, that it wasn't exactly the JIT model in action there.
Yeah, it's. I would say it's a twist on the just-in-time, but still, you have. A lot of his inventory is not finished products. A lot of it is work in progress. So you got wafers which are pre-processed until a certain point and ready to go to the next point. So it's still a just-in-time environment, but I would say accommodating the fact that it takes 3-4 months very often to produce a chips in a normal time against less than a day to produce a car. This is what. This is the imbalance which needs to be dealt with here.
Well, for those of you who want to hear more about it from Toyota, tomorrow morning we're speaking to the Vice President of Logistics in Europe, and I think we'll hear more about why he thinks it still is the Toyota way that helped him in this, but we'll leave that for tomorrow morning. I'd like to close here just by asking you each to just maybe leave us with some last reflections on what's the most important things that need to happen now, so that when we reprise this conversation, hopefully again next year or soon, that we've seen the industry take the direction that you've outlined, the hopeful direction of that better understanding, control, visibility, and obviously regional supply possibilities. What's the most important next steps? And I'll start with you, Bettina.
I think there's a huge opportunity in this crisis. If we work together, all stakeholders along the supply chains, and actually maybe do some modeling in terms of supply and demand patterns, inventory, expectations from end customers and expectations from device manufacturers, I think we can map something that actually illustrates where the choke points are and where the current vulnerabilities are in the supply chain. Transparency, visibility, and dialogue will be, I think, really important ingredients to not have this happen again. Risk mitigation, and Mike touched on that just a little bit, is hugely important. Nobody wants to carry all the risks. So how can we, in a more integrated strategy and in a more integrated supply chain conversation, make sure that risk and reward are both more equally distributed? So I think I would really drill down into a model that looks at how can we fix current choke points and address pain points collectively.
Great, thank you, Mike. What would be your parting words of wisdom to get us on the right track?
Yeah, I guess I would put it sort of in three phases. Auto OEMs need to really take stock of what it is they need to purchase all the way down to the wafer level. Because many of them don't actually know what wafers to ask for to build a particular car. That's a problem, needs to be fixed. Tier ones, I believe, will be morphing to deliver architectures versus point products. Right now, the car is a more balkanized set of electronic functions, and it needs to become much more holistic, much more hierarchical. This is a data center on wheels, right? This is not the car that you remember from 20, 30 years ago. And I think finally, there's a tremendous opportunity for OEMs to realize they are really important and a good customer of the semiconductor space, and they can get in the front of the technology train and really drive the technologies they want to see wind up in their car and incent their suppliers to use the technologies that they have pre-selected versus being sort of subject to randomness, the random interests of different people making different choices. I think it's a tremendous opportunity and one that I think some are already embracing. So I think you'll see more of that in the future.
Great. And Jeremy, what about from your side?
So I would see two things. So first, learning again from Renaissance here, longer term firm commitments from the OEMs to the chip vendors to secure the capacity. This is something Mike mentioned before. I think this is you cannot expect the chip vendors to take all the risk and start the production ahead of a firm order, just hoping an order is going to come, because this is the way it has been functioning for a while. On another thing, I would continue on what Bettina was saying on the need for more transparency on mapping the demand, the risk. So this we completely agree. We got a lot of demand in this direction, and we started an initiative on that as well, trying to car by car to identify which chips are needed for which ECU, from which supplier, fabricated on which process node, in which fab, so that early enough you can actually identify the choke points, your vulnerability, how much of your production is aggregated or in one fab, for example, so how exposed you are. So these are some of the tools which are not missing today, which needs to be developed.
Well, I want to thank you all. I think in the last 40 minutes or so, we've really packed a tremendous amount of valuable insight and actual concrete direction that the industry is both taking and can still take. Hugely valuable and interesting to me, and I know for this European and indeed global audience tuning in. So Bettina Weiss, Mike Hogan, Jeremy Bouchard, thank you so much for your time and insight here. It was great to have you at Automotive Logistics Supply Chain Europe Live.
Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.